In 1960, the United States government lied to its closest ally. It didn't lie just once. It wasn't a minor fib. It wasn't an oversight. It lied systemically over the course of many years, using television, journalists, and a meticulously crafted billion-dollar movie set. The ally was Denmark, and the movie set was an entire city, a real, functioning city built beneath 2 miles of Greenland ice, complete with a hospital, a chapel, a movie theater, and its very own nuclear reactor. This city was broadcast in prime time to the entire American public. Journalists hailed it as an outpost of civilization. It was shown in schools as the ultimate triumph of human engineering over nature. And nobody, literally nobody, except for a handful of people inside the Pentagon, knew that what was actually being built wasn't a scientific research base at all. It was a launch pad for 600 nuclear missiles aimed directly at Moscow. This is the story of how the United States secretly turned the sovereign territory of an allied nation into the largest underground nuclear arsenal on the planet. How they hid it for 6 years, how they were exposed not by an enemy spy, not by an investigative journalist, not by a traitor, but by the slowest, most patient, and most ruthless adversary that has ever existed. And most importantly, why the consequences of this deception 70 years later are beginning to thaw out and reach the surface. Literally. This is Project Iceworm, and until 1997, almost no one in the world knew it existed. To understand how a deception of this magnitude was even possible, you have to understand the America of the early 1960s. It was an era of absolute, unshakable self-confidence. The victory in World War II was in the rearview mirror. Ahead lay the space race, the atom, and infinite technological horizon. The middle class was buying homes in the suburbs. Kids were growing up on milk and optimism. The television set in the living room had become as essential to the American home as the refrigerator and the flag over the porch. And the primary voice coming out of that television, a voice trusted more than the president, more than any priest, more than your own neighbor, was Walter Cronkite, the anchor of the CBS Evening News, the man who would later be named in official polls as the most trusted man in America. That isn't an exaggeration. It was a sociological fact.
When Cronkite spoke, America listened, not because he was a charismatic orator, but because he was fundamentally calm. His voice didn't rise or fall where other journalists tried to build tension. He simply delivered the facts with the tone of a man who had seen enough not to be surprised, but still believed in his audience enough to tell them the truth. That evening, he stood in a brightly lit corridor and looked straight into the camera. Behind him stretched a tunnel, long, pristine, with walls made of compressed snow and a ceiling formed by a steel arch. There were doors on either side. Behind one was a mess hall for 200 people, smelling of hot coffee and fried potatoes. Behind another was an infirmary with a full suite of surgical equipment. Further down the hall was a chapel that sat 40, with wooden pews and a simple cross on the wall. Further still, a movie theater, a library, recreation rooms, hot showers, central heating, a working telephone line. All of this was buried deep beneath the Greenland ice sheet.
Cronkite talked about it calmly, but with poorly concealed awe, the way one talks about a miracle that happens to be an objective fact. American military engineers had built a city under the ice, a real functioning city with its own daily routine, its own infrastructure, and even its own nuclear reactor, which powered this subterranean world just as reliably as a regular power plant powers a typical American suburb. The viewers watched and thought one thing: this is America. The report aired in prime time. It was replayed in high school civics classes. It was cited in newspapers as definitive proof that technological progress had no limits, that human engineering genius could conquer any natural environment. None of those viewers knew they were looking at a movie set. Remember that word, a movie set. Not a scientific base, not an outpost of civilization, not the city of the future. A movie set. Meticulously constructed, astronomically expensive, and convincing just enough to ensure nobody asked the next logical question.
And the next logical question was simple. Why does a scientific base in Greenland need 2.5 miles of tunnels when meteorological observations and ice core research only require a single lab and a few storage sheds? Why does military infrastructure of this scale in peacetime need a mobile nuclear reactor that can be disassembled and evacuated in 48 hours? And why is all of this being built at such a frantic pace with such massive funding and under a veil of secrecy that has absolutely nothing to do with studying snowpack? Nobody allowed journalists to ask these questions, and they didn't ask them themselves, because in America in 1960, that just wasn't done. Trust in the military was absolute. Beneath that exact same sheet of ice, just a few hundred yards from the chapel and the movie theater, Army engineers were digging a very different network of tunnels. Not for people, for 600 intercontinental ballistic missiles, each one capable of reaching Moscow in 18 minutes. The operation was called Project Iceworm, and you're about to find out why it was perhaps the most cynical military gambit of the entire Cold War. The cynicism of this operation wasn't that it was aimed at the Soviet Union. Everything in those years was aimed at the Soviet Union. It was the Cold War, and the two sides did what sides do in a war. The cynicism was that it was aimed at an ally, against a country that had signed a mutual defense treaty with the US, that had allowed American military installations on its soil, and that believed, sincerely, in good faith, the way honest people believe, that it knew exactly what was being hosted on its territory. To understand the depth of this betrayal, you have to understand the Denmark of the 1950s. Imagine a small northern nation, 5 million people, just emerging from 5 years of brutal Nazi occupation, knowing firsthand what it means to be a pawn in someone else's war, and making one very clear, unequivocal decision for itself: never again.
Denmark joined NATO voluntarily and consciously. Its politicians understood that a small country caught between two superpowers couldn't afford neutrality. But they also understood that an alliance must have boundaries. And the Danish parliament passed a law that was as clear as it was brief. The territory of Denmark, including Greenland and the Faroe Islands, is a nuclear-free zone. No nuclear weapons, no warheads, no nuclear-tipped missiles. Not on Danish soil, not in Danish waters, not in territories under Danish sovereignty. This wasn't some declarative document meant for domestic PR. It was a hardline stance that Danish diplomats explicitly communicated to their American partners at every single meeting. Copenhagen knew it was in a tight spot, a small nation wedged between two giants, one an ally, the other a potential adversary. That is exactly why Denmark so meticulously crafted its own identity within the alliance. Yes, we are with you, but we have lines we do not cross. The nuclear-free status was one of those lines. Washington knew this. Washington took it into account. And Washington completely ignored it. Here is a crucial detail that is usually overlooked. The Americans didn't tell the Danes, "Your nuclear-free law doesn't work for us. We're deploying weapons regardless." That would have been an open conflict between allies. A conflict like that can be managed diplomatically, through public opinion, or at the NATO level. The Americans did something much worse. They signed a treaty with Denmark in which the Danes saw one thing and American lawyers saw another, and they exploited the gap in interpretation. This is a highly specific form of deception. Not a lie, not a violation, but using an ally's trust as a tool to bypass their own laws. Remember this tactic. You will see it many times throughout the 20th century, and not just from the Americans. In 1951, the US and Denmark signed the Defense of Greenland Agreement. The Danish side saw a document about defense cooperation, early warning radar stations, logistics bases, meteorological outposts, everything necessary for collective security within NATO. The document was technical, polite, and fully aligned with the spirit of the alliance.
The American side saw something entirely different. They saw legal cover for a completely different project. The text of the agreement was drafted with a false bottom, broad enough that American lawyers could later argue the treaty hadn't technically been violated, narrow enough that Danish officials, reading it, wouldn't suspect anything beyond what they were being shown. When the diplomats from Copenhagen signed that document, they were absolutely certain they understood what they were signing. They had studied the text, consulted their lawyers, approved the phrasing. They understood absolutely nothing. 9 years later, in 1960, a dry, strategic memorandum materialized deep within the bowels of the American military establishment. Not a single wasted word. This is exactly how documents are written by men who have long since stopped asking moral questions and have moved on to purely technical ones. It laid out the concept for Project Iceworm. An extensive network of tunnels, totaling 2,500 miles, is to be carved out beneath the Greenland ice sheet. 600 Iceman ballistic missiles are to be deployed on mobile transport platforms within these tunnels. Mobility is paramount. The missiles will continuously move through the tunnel system along unpredictable routes. This renders them impossible for Soviet intelligence to pinpoint from the air or from space.
Even if the enemy knows the base exists, they will never know exactly where a specific missile is at any given moment. On paper, it looked like the ultimate strategic concept, an invisible, moving, invulnerable nuclear arsenal right on the Soviet Union's doorstep. On paper. The task handed to the Army Corps of Engineers to execute this concept was formulated simply and executed with military literalness. Carve 2,500 miles of tunnels into a living glacier, outfit them with a rail system to move missile platforms, provide autonomous power generation, and ensure that the surface-level section of the base looks exactly like a scientific research station. Convincing, detailed, complete with journalists and television cameras that will film reports and broadcast them on the evening news. To dig the tunnels, they used colossal Swiss rotary snowplows called Peter Snowmillers, machines the size of a 2-story house that chewed through the ice with the precision of an industrial drill. The machine moved forward, leaving a perfectly rectangular tunnel cross-section behind it. The excavated ice was ejected backward on a conveyor belt and compressed to form the walls. Right behind it came the riggers, installing steel arch sections, each weighing several tons. But these are just dry, technical facts. To understand what was actually happening down there, you have to imagine what those reports left out. Imagine a guy in blue coveralls, 25 years old, a former welder from Ohio, drafted into the Army Corps of Engineers. He's working 3 shifts, 8 hours a day. Outside, it's minus 40 degrees. Inside the tunnel, it's 40 degrees Fahrenheit, but the air is thick, damp, and heavy with the smell of diesel exhaust and hot metal. The noise from the milling machine is so deafening, you have to scream directly into the ear of the guy next to you. He doesn't see daylight for weeks, sometimes months. Above him are 2 miles of solid ice. His only connection to the outside world is a single radio in the command post. Military doctors documented a specific condition they dubbed sub-ice syndrome. Depression, disorientation in time, auditory hallucinations. Men started thinking the ice above them was creaking, talking, moving. The most fascinating part of these hallucinations is that they were actually true. The ice was moving. It was just moving too slowly for human senses to consciously register. We'll get back to that. In 1961, they lowered the PM-2A reactor beneath the ice.
This was the world's first portable nuclear reactor. It was a development that American military engineers were justifiably proud of, and they had every right to be. Technically, it was a staggering achievement. a compact nuclear plant with a thermal output of 1.5 megawatts that could be disassembled into transportable modules, hauled across brutal, roadless terrain, and reassembled on-site without a permanent foundation or stationary infrastructure. Each section was designed to fit on a standard military sled and be dragged across the Greenland ice by an ordinary army tractor. Think about that for a second. A nuclear reactor dragged by a tractor across the ice. In 1960, this was science fiction brought to life as engineering reality. The reactor was transported in pieces. The nuclear fuel traveled in a separate, triple-reinforced container under heavy armed guard. The reactor vessel was shipped separately. The heat exchangers, pumps, control systems, all shipped separately in specialized crates marked with codes that meant nothing to a casual observer.
On site, assembly took several months. Then, they powered it up. It worked, stable, reliable, providing electricity to the entire base, both the scientific surface camp and what was being built deeper down. The military engineers looked at the control panels and saw exactly what they wanted to see: proof that technology had conquered geography. Cronkite's broadcast was filmed at this exact moment, at the absolute peak of self-congratulation. The journalists were shown exactly what they were meant to see: the mess hall, the chapel, the theater. The reactor presented as a high-tech household appliance, providing comfort for the men. The missile tunnels were in a different sector, off-limits to the press. The explanation was simple: ongoing construction, lots of dust, it's dangerous, and honestly, nothing interesting for viewers to see. The journalists didn't press the issue. We need to pause here and say something uncomfortable. The journalists in this story are not victims, and they weren't naive fools. Veteran CBS reporters knew exactly how to ask hard questions. They did it in Korea. They would do it in Vietnam just a few years later. But in Greenland in 1960, they didn't ask questions because they didn't want to. Because a story about a futuristic science base under the ice sold much better than suspicions about a covert military op. Because the patriotic consensus of the Cold War made criticizing the Pentagon professionally inconvenient. This is a crucial mechanism that repeats itself throughout many stories of the 20th century. Power rarely hides information completely. More often, it simply packages it in a format that the media finds more profitable to accept than to deconstruct. The Pentagon didn't lie to the journalists outright. It offered them a beautiful story, and they took it with gratitude. And then comes the part that nobody saw coming. Not the Pentagon, not the journalists, not the Danish government. Only the glaciologists. While the military engineers were popping champagne over their technical triumph, a different group of men was working on the far side of the base: the glaciologists, scientists whose entire specialty was the behavior of massive ice sheets.
And the data they were pulling didn't align with what military planners wanted to hear. The Greenland ice sheet isn't a static object. It is a dynamic system in constant motion. Gravity pulls the colossal mass of ice downward and toward the edges of the island. This movement is slow, about 3 feet per year in the area of Camp Century, but it is absolutely continuous and utterly unstoppable. 3 feet a year. Remember that number. It sounds insignificant. In a minute, you'll realize that it was a death sentence for the entire project. No steel structure inside a glacier can withstand that movement indefinitely. It can slow the deformation, it can distribute the load, but in the long run, the glacier always wins. Simply because it possesses something no human engineering construct has: infinite patience and infinite weight. The glaciologists wrote this in their reports, clearly and without diplomatic softening. They provided hard numbers: the speed of the ice flow, the projected pressure on the steel arches in 5 years, in 10, in 20. They issued a forecast. The structures will begin to buckle much sooner than military command anticipates. The rate of deformation will accelerate non-linearly. Past a certain point, no reinforcement system will save it. The data they were pulling didn't align with what military planners wanted to hear. The Greenland ice sheet isn't a static object. It is a dynamic system in constant motion. Gravity pulls the colossal mass of ice downward and toward the edges of the island. This movement is slow, about 3 feet per year in the area of Camp Century, but it is absolutely continuous and utterly unstoppable. 3 feet a year. Remember that number. It sounds insignificant. In a minute, you'll realize that it was a death sentence for the entire project. No steel structure inside a glacier can withstand that movement indefinitely. It can slow the deformation, it can distribute the load, but in the long run, the glacier always wins, simply because it possesses something no human engineering construct has: infinite patience and infinite weight. The glaciologists wrote this in their reports, clearly and without diplomatic softening. They provided hard numbers: the speed of the ice flow, the projected pressure on the steel arches in 5 years, in 10, in 20. They issued a forecast. The structures will begin to buckle much sooner than military command anticipates. The rate of deformation will accelerate non-linearly. Past a certain point, no reinforcement system will save it.
Military command read these reports and decided to keep digging. Today, it's easy to call that decision madness, but in the context of 1960, it had its own logic. The exact same logic that births all disasters of this kind. The logic of top-down pressure. President Eisenhower wanted a strategic advantage. The Pentagon wanted to show the president results. Project Command wanted to show the Pentagon progress. Every level in that hierarchy was incapable of turning around and telling the level above them, you know, the scientists are telling us this is never going to work. In a system of top-down pressure, the voice of a glaciologist with his boring numbers about 3 feet a year and structural deformation was just inconvenient noise. Noise that was much easier to silence than to hear. The engineers kept building. The glacier kept moving. This is the most fascinating part of the whole story, and the most instructive. Project Iceworm didn't fail because the Pentagon was ignorant. The Pentagon knew everything. They had detailed scientific reports sitting on their desks with exact calculations and forecasts. They simply chose to ignore them. Military command read these reports and decided to keep digging. Today, it's easy to call that decision madness, but in the context of 1960, it had its own logic, the exact same logic that births all disasters of this kind, the logic of top-down pressure. President Eisenhower wanted a strategic advantage. The Pentagon wanted to show the president results. Project Command wanted to show the Pentagon progress. Every level in that hierarchy was incapable of turning around and telling the level above them, you know, the scientists are telling us this is never going to work. In a system of top-down pressure, the voice of a glaciologist, with his boring numbers about 3 feet a year and structural deformation, was just inconvenient noise. Noise that was much easier to silence than to hear. The engineers kept building. The glacier kept moving. This is the most fascinating part of the whole story, and the most instructive. Project Iceworm didn't fail because the Pentagon was ignorant. The Pentagon knew everything. They had detailed scientific reports sitting on their desks with exact calculations and forecasts. They simply chose to ignore them. This is a critical pattern that repeats itself over and over again in the history of mega disasters of the 20th and 21st centuries. From Chernobyl to Fukushima, from the space shuttle program to the 2008 financial crisis, it is always the exact same script. The experts issue a warning. The hierarchy refuses to listen. The decision is made to push forward. A few years later, reality comes knocking to collect its debts. The glaciologists in Greenland in 1960 were those experts. They were listened to, they were thanked for their service, their reports were filed away in an archive, and the digging continued. The first physical signs that the calculations were off appeared in 1963. The tunnels began to shrink. Not suddenly, not catastrophically, but exactly as the glaciologists had predicted in their inconvenient reports. Millimeter by millimeter, week by week. Steel arches that had perfectly aligned geometry upon installation began to develop microfractures in their weld seams. The pressure from the ice wasn't distributing evenly across the structure. In some spots, the load exceeded design limits by 150 to 200%.
Engineers reinforced the problem areas, added cross-bracing, recalculated the loads, altered the angles of the supports. They were working like a good mechanic trying to fix a car engine while driving down the highway, knowing there's a crack in the block, but not yet realizing how deep it goes. By 1964, it became obvious. The crack went all the way through. The speed of the tunnel deformation was exceeding every revised forecast, not just the initial military calculations. Those had been wrong from day one. Even the revised forecasts of the glaciologists, which had initially seemed pessimistic, now looked overly optimistic. In several sectors, pipelines ruptured under lateral pressure. Ventilation shafts began changing shape, morphing from rectangles into trapezoids, then into warped, irregular polygons. The rail tracks, meant for the missile platforms, began to buckle upward where the pressure from below was particularly intense. But the most critical issue involved the reactor. The PM-2A was housed in a specially reinforced sector. Military engineers understood that a nuclear plant required specialized protection and had paid maximum attention to the structural integrity of the reactor bay. But the glacier didn't care that this bay was special.
The pressure distributed itself evenly across the entire ice mass, and the specialized reinforcements merely slowed the deformation. They didn't stop it. By 1965, the nuclear engineers stationed at the base began detecting microshifts in the structural housing of the reactor core. The shifts were within acceptable safety margins, for now. In nuclear engineering, for now are the two words that make sane engineers pull the plug on a project. The Pentagon issued the evacuation order in 1966. It was the right decision, belated but right. If the reactor had continued operating for another couple of years, we'd be telling a very different story right now, one with a much higher body count and vastly worse consequences. But how that evacuation was carried out tells you more about the system than the decision to evacuate itself. The reactor was dismantled and extracted meticulously, strictly adhering to nuclear safety protocols, every component packed into a specialized container, fully documented. The expensive equipment was loaded onto cargo planes. Classified documents were either shredded or flown out. Anything of value to the Department of Defense left the base. Everything else stayed. Roughly 53,000 gallons of diesel fuel in underground storage tanks. The biological waste of several hundred men who had lived on the base for 6 years. Sewage, medical waste, everyday garbage. Everything generated by human habitation that had been methodically dumped into specialized sumps carved into the ice. And this is the most important part: the radioactive coolant fluid from the reactor. Not the fuel rods, those were evacuated, but the primary coolant that had circulated around the reactor core and inevitably accumulated radioactive contamination. In the official evacuation documents, this was written off with a brief bureaucratic note. Certain materials abandoned in place due to logistical transportation difficulties. Logistical transportation difficulties. Remember that phrase. It's going to surface again in diplomatic negotiations half a century later.
The logic the military applied to this decision was simple, and in the context of 1966, it seemed perfectly sound. The Greenland ice sheet is one of the most stable natural reservoirs on the planet. Ice has been accumulating there for hundreds of thousands of years. Any contamination left below the surface will simply be buried by new layers of snow, compressed into ice, and entombed at a depth unreachable by any biological or chemical processes. It wasn't a waste dump. It was geological entombment. It would have worked if the climate wasn't changing. We need to pause here and state something that is often left out of this story. The military brass of 1966 weren't cartoon villains. They made a decision based on the scientific consensus of their time. Climatology, as a science of global warming, did not exist yet. The idea that the Greenland ice sheet might begin melting on a massive scale in the foreseeable future belonged to the realm of science fiction in the 1960s.
To them, what they were leaving under the ice was truly going down there forever. Like garbage dropped to the bottom of the Mariana Trench. It just vanishes from the world. They couldn't have known. But we know. And the question of accountability that we're about to get to isn't a question for the generals of 1966. It's a question for the governments of the 2020s, who know everything, who have all the documents, and who continue to do absolutely nothing. Which brings us to right now. In 1997, a report was published in Denmark that, 30 years late, finally did what should have been done from the start. It called things by their real names. The Danish Institute of International Affairs had gained access to declassified American archives and conducted a detailed analysis of exactly what had transpired in Greenland between the 1950s and 60s. The report's conclusions were delivered in the restrained, academic tone typical of scholarly publications. But behind that restraint was something that polite academic language is ill-equipped to handle. The government of an allied nation had, for years, systematically violated the explicit legislative stance of Denmark. It had concealed this violation using media spin, diplomatic doublespeak, and the veil of national security classification, all while regularly affirming their mutual trust and allied partnership during bilateral negotiations. In other words, they smiled at Danish diplomats, shook their hands, signed new treaties with them, and simultaneously broke their laws on their own soil. Copenhagen reacted with restraint, the way governments react when they discover something that cannot be undone, but is highly inconvenient to discuss in public. Official protests were lodged. Official responses were received from Washington. The phrasing on both sides was meticulously calibrated to acknowledge the exchange of views without creating any precedents that might disrupt the current state of the NATO alliance. The scandal was real. The fallout was managed. Because by 1997, the Cold War was over. The missiles never flew. The reactor had been removed. The base was shut down. It was easy to write it off as a historical misstep, a different era with a different logic. To argue that in the face of an existential clash between two global systems, allies made compromises that look unacceptable today, but felt necessary at the time. It's a standard rhetorical maneuver, and it works, almost always. But there is one element in this story that refuses to let the case be closed alongside the Cold War. The ice kept melting. In 2016, a team of scientists led by William Colgan from the Geological Survey of Denmark and Greenland published a paper in the journal Nature Climate Change. The authors ran detailed climate modeling using current data on the melt rate of the Greenland ice sheet, and they applied those models to the known location of Camp Century and the known inventory of the waste abandoned there. The results were published without sensational headlines, just numbers and projections.
At the current rate of glacial melt, the toxic and radioactive materials buried at Camp Century will begin to reach the surface by the end of this century. Not in 1,000 years, not in 500. Children being born today in Copenhagen, in Moscow, in New York, will live to see the day when the toxic waste of the Cold War thaws out of the Greenland ice and bleeds into the Arctic Ocean. The volume of this waste isn't catastrophic in absolute numbers. 53,000 gallons of diesel fuel, a certain amount of radioactive coolant, organic waste. For the global ocean, it's a drop in the bucket. But it's a drop with a specific legal address, specific liable parties, and a highly specific political dimension. And this is where the most unpleasant part of the story begins, the part that is happening right now. The legal question of who is responsible for cleaning up this mess remains unresolved to this day. The United States created the waste. Denmark owns the territory. Greenland, having gained expanded autonomy in 2009, now considers itself an active party to the dispute as well. All three sides acknowledge the problem exists. All three have been engaged in diplomatic talks for years. Not a single party has taken on legally binding obligations regarding a timeline or method for the cleanup. This isn't because the problem is technically unsolvable. Technically, it can be solved. It's expensive, it's difficult, it requires highly specialized equipment, but it can be done. It's because solving it requires one of the parties, or both, or all three, to publicly accept responsibility for what was done 70 years ago. And in politics, taking responsibility for the past always equals spending money in the present, something nobody ever wants to do voluntarily. So the negotiations drag on, the reports are drafted, committees hold meetings, and the ice melts. Project Iceworm didn't fail because the KGB uncovered it, not because Danish intelligence got suspicious, not because of a human error or a freak accident.
There was no discarded receipt, no accidental slip on an open phone line, no momentary lapse of greed after years of flawless operational security. There was just a glacier. The Pentagon spent billions of dollars, deployed the best military engineers in the country, built the world's first portable nuclear reactor, and fired it up in the Arctic, engineered a media cover-up that successfully convinced the entire world for years, including its allies, including journalists, including the Danish diplomats sitting right across the table, that a science base was being built in Greenland. And they lost to a river. A river of ice flowing at 3 feet a year. A river that has no deadlines, no military budget, no top-down political pressure. It only has time, and it has weight. And that proved to be enough. They thought they were building an arsenal inside eternal ice. They missed one detail, one so obvious that it's easy to overlook entirely, because it's almost too simple to see. There is no such thing as eternal ice. There is only ice that hasn't melted yet. The glaciologists told them this from day one. Not about the melting, but about the movement. The principle is the same. Nature never signed a treaty with the Pentagon. It never took on any allied obligations. It just did what it always does.
It moved. It melted. It regurgitated what was buried inside it. The difference between eternal ice and ice that hasn't melted yet is 53,000 gallons of toxic waste at the bottom of the Greenland ice sheet. It's an open diplomatic dispute that 3 governments have been kicking back and forth for almost 3 decades. And it's a scientific paper in Nature Climate Change, read by a few thousand specialists and almost 0 decision makers. They built a system that no enemy could hack. They forgot that a system can't negotiate with physics. And now, the ultimate question, the one the investigations never truly answered. When the melting glacier begins vomiting the radioactive legacy of the Cold War into the Arctic Ocean in the coming decades, who exactly is responsible? The military brass of 1966, who made the call to ditch the waste and fly home? Those men have been dead for years. You can't indict them. You can't even depose them.
Or is it the current governments, who have known about this ticking clock for almost 30 years, who possess all the files, all the scientific models, all the necessary executive power, and who continue to hold talks instead of making a decision, because a decision costs money, and talks just cost time. Time which, according to the melt rate graphs, is rapidly running out. Let me know in the comments what you think. Who do you think should be cleaning this up? The ones who buried it, or the ones who know about it and stay silent? While you're typing your answer, the ice keeps melting. Every single day. Right now. And that is perhaps the most terrifying part of the Project Iceworm story. It isn't over yet.